In our previous four-part series on the origins of Freemasonry, we discussed how in 1717, four London lodges came together to form the premier Grand Lodge of England. It was an unprecedented experiment. It was the first attempt to place Freemasonry under a centralized authority, with standardized rules, regulated warrants, and an emerging vision of order, refinement, and institutional control. For its founders, this new Grand Lodge represented progress, bringing structure and respectability to a craft that had long been local, informal, and diverse. For a time, the system held. But as London grew into a vast imperial capital, waves of Irish migrants brought with them older customs, familiar rituals, and a form of masonry shaped by hardship, fellowship, and necessity. What they encountered in England was what they perceived as a changing institution, more centralized, more refined, and increasingly controlled by elite authority. What had been designed as a unifying authority now faced a challenge it could not fully control. From this collision between institutional order and migrant tradition emerged one of the most consequential rivalries in Masonic history, the Ancients and the Moderns. In this video, we will explore how immigration, ritual change, and competing ideas of authority fractured English Freemasonry, turning a single Grand Lodge into rival systems locked in a decades-long struggle over legitimacy and identity. But first, don't forget to subscribe. To better understand the conflict, we must first travel outside of England to Ireland. Operative guilds of stonemasons existed in Ireland going back centuries. But much like in England and Scotland, they gradually opened their doors to non-operative members and evolved into broader civic and social spaces. In 1725, the Grand Lodge of Ireland was formally established, making it the second oldest Grand Lodge in the world, and it emerged directly in the wake of the premier Grand Lodge of England founded in 1717. Its founders consciously set out to imitate the English model of centralized Masonic authority, adopting similar structures, offices, constitutions, and lodge warrants in order to bring regularity and oversight to what had previously been independent and loosely organized lodges in Ireland. As a result, Freemasonry immediately took off in Ireland, where lodges began to be established across the country, not just in Protestant enclaves, but also across Catholic Ireland as well. The Grand Lodge of Ireland differed from the premier Grand Lodge of England in several important ways, particularly in how authority was exercised and how flexible its system of governance was. First, the Grand Lodge of Ireland developed a reputation for being more decentralized and pragmatic. While England emphasized tighter central control over warrants, ritual uniformity, and lodge regulation, Ireland was more willing to recognize and regularize existing lodges, even when their practices differed. This made Irish Freemasonry more adaptable, but also more varied in ritual and administration. Second, Ireland was quicker and more liberal in issuing warrants, which they tied to the individual members of a lodge, not the location in which they met like they did in England. This allowed for traveling lodges such as military lodges to operate. Irish warrants were widely granted to army regiments, allowing Irish Freemasonry to spread rapidly, not just in Ireland, but across the British Empire and Europe. England was initially more cautious and restrictive in this regard. Irish Freemasonry was generally more accessible to the common man than its English counterpart because of its looser social barriers, practical governance, and emphasis on fellowship over formality. Unlike the premier Grand Lodge of England, which increasingly attracted gentlemen, professionals, and social elites, Irish Freemasonry retained a strong base among artisans, tradesmen, soldiers, and laborers. Lodge fees were often lower, meeting places were more modest, and social status mattered less than willingness to participate and conform to basic Masonic obligations. This made entry easier for working men, especially in urban centers and military settings. The liberal issuing of warrants, particularly to military and traveling lodges, further widened access. Men could join a lodge attached to a regiment, workplace, or local community rather than needing elite sponsorship. As a result, Irish lodges became important social and support networks within migrant communities, offering fellowship, mutual aid, and identity in a foreign city. By the 1730s, economic hardship in Ireland and better employment prospects in Britain encouraged sustained Irish migration to London, largely among Protestant laborers, artisans, and soldiers. By mid-century, the Irish population in London may have reached around 10% of the city's population. Irish lodges, which were forming in England, offered practical assistance. Brethren helped one another find employment and secure lodging. Informal charity, mutual aid during illness or unemployment, and support for widows and families were common lodge functions, making Freemasonry a substitute for the kinship networks many migrants had left behind. Masonic lodges provided an immediate sense of belonging and identity in a vast and often hostile city. Membership connected newcomers to fellow countrymen who shared familiar customs, accents, and rituals, easing the transition into urban life. In 1735, the Premier Grand Lodge of England refused formal recognition to the Master and Wardens of an Irish lodge who presented themselves in London as a deputation acting under the authority of Lord Kingston, then Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, and himself a former Grand Master of the English Grand Lodge. Although the English Grand Lodge was willing to admit the Irish brethren individually, it did so only on the condition that they submit to the English constitution and practices. The Irish Masons rejected this requirement, viewing it as an infringement on the authority and legitimacy of their own Grand Lodge, and the deputation was consequently denied recognition as such. This incident occurred against the backdrop of significant changes within English Freemasonry during the 1730s. In response to a growing number of public exposures of Masonic ritual, the English Grand Lodge altered and standardized its ceremonial work in an effort to protect its secrets and maintain institutional control. These innovations, however, alienated many Masons, particularly those accustomed to older forms of ritual practiced in Ireland and elsewhere. Irish brethren often found the revised English rituals and centralized authority unfamiliar, restrictive, or unrecognizable, and many were unwilling to abandon the traditions under which they had originally been initiated. As a result, they either formed their own lodges under Irish customs or gravitated toward the numerous unaffiliated lodges operating independently in the capital, which were growing in number. As in Ireland, these growing unaffiliated lodges were more accessible to the common man, both Irish and non-Irish, in contrast to those that were chartered under the Premier Grand Lodge, which were still very elitist and only accessible to the more wealthy. By 1751, 5 of these independent London lodges, joined later by a 6th newly established lodge, came together to form a rival Grand Lodge, known as the Grand Lodge of the Most Ancient and Honorable Fraternity of Free and Accepted Masons, which soon positioned itself as a coordinating body for other unaffiliated lodges throughout England. This new organization drew heavily on Irish influence and older Masonic practices, and its creation marked a decisive moment in the institutional division of English Freemasonry, rooted in disputes over authority, ritual, and tradition. The rival English Grand Lodges came to be known as the Ancients and the Moderns. The original Premier Grand Lodge of England was labeled the Moderns by its opponents because of its changes to ritual, wording, and ceremonial practices, largely in response to public exposures and a desire for greater standardization. These alterations were viewed by many, especially Irish and Scottish Masons, as unnecessary innovations that departed from the older forms of Masonry they had been taught. In contrast, the newer rival Grand Lodge deliberately styled itself the Ancients to emphasize its claim that it preserved the ancient landmarks, rituals, and usages of Freemasonry. The Ancients portrayed themselves as guardians of traditional Masonry against what they saw as the Moderns' innovations. If you want to learn more about these two rival Grand Lodges and how they impacted Freemasonry today, please subscribe and stay tuned for part 2 of the series.